My name is Anya, and for the longest time, my life was defined by the quiet echo in a house that was never truly my home. But tonight is different. Tonight, the air isn't quiet. It's buzzing with celebration, with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of expensive gossip. From where I'm standing, tucked away near a potted ficus, I have a perfect view of my Aunt Beatrice. She is in her element, a shark gliding through shimmering waters, her sequined dress catching the light like fish scales. She's greeting the mayor, her smile a masterclass in practiced warmth, all while subtly adjusting her position so the photographers can catch her good side. She thinks this night is about her. In her mind, she is the guest of honor at a gala, celebrating her. Her importance, her influence, her impeccable taste. What she doesn't know, what she can't possibly comprehend, is that the magnificent state-of-the-art building she's standing in, the very building that has been the source of her unending rage for the past 6 months, is a monument to a secret I've kept buried deep in my heart. She's about to discover that the brand new veterinary and adoption wing, the one that now irrevocably ruins her pristine, manicured view of the rolling hills, is dedicated to an anonymous benefactor she never knew she had. And that anonymous benefactor is me. My story with my aunt and uncle, Beatrice and Richard, began the way many tragedies do, with a car accident. I was 10 years old when I lost my parents, and in the sterile, hushed quiet of a lawyer's office, I was handed over to them like a parcel. They were my mother's older sister and her husband, my only living relatives. They lived in a world I'd only seen in magazines, a sprawling estate in Crestwood Hills, a place where the lawns were greener, the cars were shinier, and the people were polished to a blinding sheen. They took me in, and for that, I was supposed to be eternally grateful. Gratitude was the rent I paid for the space I occupied in their lives. It was mentioned constantly, a verbal receipt for their generosity. Be grateful for the roof over your head, Anya. Be grateful for the clothes on your back. Be grateful we're putting you through school. Their generosity felt like a finely crafted cage, beautiful on the outside, but cold and empty within. I wasn't family. I was a charity project, a box they had to tick on the checklist of being good, respectable people. They were obsessed with image above all else. Their lives were a carefully curated performance for an audience of their wealthy neighbors and country club members. Every dinner party, every charity auction, every casual brunch was a scene in a play, and I was a silent stagehand, expected to be invisible until needed, and then to perform my role as the demure, thankful orphan with flawless precision. The true star of their lives, the one for whom no expense was spared, was their son, Julian. He was my cousin, 10 years my senior, a man who lived in the city and worked a vague but impressive-sounding job as a strategic consultant. He was the golden child, the one whose infrequent visits were treated like royal appearances. His every minor success was trumpeted, while my own achievements were met with polite, dismissive smiles. The inciting incident, the moment the first crack appeared in my long silent endurance, happened 6 months ago, at one of their perfectly staged Sunday dinners. I was there, as always, to round out the table and pour the wine. Julian was not. He was, as Beatrice explained with a proud sigh, summering in the Hamptons. The topic of conversation, as it had been for weeks, was the local animal shelter, Paws and Hope. It was a small, perpetually struggling operation, nestled on a plot of land at the edge of town, just visible from my aunt and uncle's expansive back patio if you squinted. To them, it wasn't a sanctuary for the lost and lonely. It was an eyesore, a blemish on their otherwise perfect canvas. Richard, swirling a Bordeaux that cost more than my monthly rent, started the tirade. He was a man whose voice boomed with the unearned confidence of inherited wealth. The council meeting is on Tuesday, he announced to the table, which included the Fletchers from down the road and a local property developer. We have the votes. That dilapidated shed is finally going to be rezoned. We'll have it torn down by Christmas. Beatrice chimed in, her voice like chimes of ice. It's not just the view. It's the noise, the barking. It's so common. It brings down the whole tone of the neighborhood. Mrs. Fletcher nodded vigorously. And the smell, on a hot day. It's simply unacceptable. I sat there, gripping my fork, my knuckles white. Pause and Hope was more than just a building to me. It was the only place I'd ever felt truly at home. But I said nothing. I had learned long ago that my opinions were not welcome at this table. The developer, a man with a hungry look in his eyes, said, "Once it's gone, that land will be prime for a few luxury townhomes, a much better use of the space." And that's when Beatrice delivered the line that would change everything. She laughed, a brittle, airy sound, and said, "Honestly, who cares about a bunch of mangy mutts when they're ruining a multi-million-dollar view? They should just put them all down and be done with it." A dead silence fell over the table for a moment. Even the developer looked slightly uncomfortable, but for me, it was like a sonic boom, a physical blow. "Put them all down." The words echoed in the vast, hollow space inside my chest, where my own grief had lived for so long. And, Ibonza Bane, it wasn't just about the shelter anymore. It was about the casual, breathtaking cruelty of it. The complete and utter lack of empathy for anything that didn't serve their perfect, pristine image. In that moment, something inside me, something that had been dormant for 20 years, finally snapped. I looked at my aunt, her face glowing with self-satisfaction, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty. The charade was over, and a plan, terrifying and thrilling, began to form in the wreckage of my silence. What they didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that 3 weeks prior, on a miserable rainy Tuesday, I had used the last $5 in my wallet to buy a lottery ticket, and against all odds I had won. After that dinner, I drove home in a daze. The cruelty of my aunt's words was a physical thing, a shard of glass working its way through my system. I left their grand estate, with its manicured lawns and sweeping driveway, and returned to my small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It was neat, it was clean, but it was profoundly lonely. This was the life they had allowed me, close enough to be convenient for their needs, but far enough away not to be an embarrassment. They paid a small portion of the rent, a fact Richard never failed to mention when he wanted something, another link in the long chain of my gratitude. I walked in, and didn't even turn on the lights. I just stood there in the dark, the city lights painting stripes across the floor. My hands were shaking. "Put them all down." The phrase kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't just a thoughtless comment. It was a philosophy. Anything inconvenient, anything imperfect, anything that didn't fit into their curated world should simply be erased. And for 20 years, I had been a part of that. I had made myself small, quiet, and agreeable, so that I wouldn't be an inconvenience. I had sanded down all my rough edges, smoothed over my own grief and personality, all to fit into their perfect picture. My gaze fell on the corkboard by my kitchen. Pinned to it, amongst unpaid bills and a grocery list, was a small, unassuming piece of paper. It was the confirmation printout from the State Lottery Commission, a number so large it looked fake. $94 million. I had opted for the lump sum, which after taxes came to just over $52 million. The money was sitting in a newly created, heavily protected bank account, a secret so immense it felt like a physical weight. My initial plan had been simple. I was going to disappear. I'd fantasized about it for weeks. I would pack a bag, buy a one-way ticket to somewhere warm and anonymous, and build a life from scratch. A life where I owed no one anything, least of all gratitude. But now, standing in the dark, that plan felt hollow. Running away felt like letting them win. It felt like letting their brand of casual cruelty triumph. That's when the flashbacks started. Not as memories, but as vivid, painful scenes playing out in the dark of my apartment. It was a highlight reel of 1,000 small cuts. I was 10 again, standing on their marble entryway floor. My worldly possessions were in a single scuffed-up brown suitcase my dad had given me. I remember Aunt Beatrice looking down at it, her lip curling just slightly. "We'll have to get you some new things, Anya," she'd said. "You can't be seen with that." She hadn't said it to be kind. She'd said it as if my suitcase, my last tangible link to my parents, was a piece of trash that had washed up on her pristine shore. Uncle Richard had put a heavy hand on my shoulder, not a comforting gesture, but a proprietary one. "You're a part of this family now," he'd said, his voice laced with a tone that implied this was a great and magnanimous sacrifice. "You just have to remember to be grateful." There it was, the first payment. Then, I was 17. I had poured my heart into a portfolio of charcoal drawings, raw and full of teenage angst, but honest. I won first place in a citywide high school art competition. The awards ceremony was held in the auditorium of a public high school across town. I was so proud. I'd ironed my one good dress and waited for them by the door, my certificate in a cardboard tube. They never came. I called them from a payphone, my voice small. "Oh, darling," Beatrice had said, her voice distant and distracted over the phone. "We're so sorry. We completely forgot. Richard has his golf club's annual dinner tonight. It's a black tie affair. We simply couldn't miss it." It wasn't that they forgot. It was that my small victory, earned in a place they considered beneath them, was less important than a social obligation. I walked home that night in the rain, the cardboard tube getting soggy in my hands, and I understood. Their love, their support, it was all conditional. It was dependent on how my achievements reflected on them. The most painful memory, the one that connected directly to the poison spewed at the dinner table, olives of a scruffy little terrier mix with one floppy ear and a tail that never stopped wagging. His name was Buster. I was 12, lost in the fog of grief and the isolating chill of my new life. I started volunteering at Paws and Hope, not just to be around animals, but to be in a place where no one expected anything from me. It was a ramshackle building, smelling of bleach and dog food, but it was warm. The people were kind, and Buster became my confidant. I would sit in his kennel, my back against the chain-link fence, and tell him everything. I cried into his matted fur about my parents, about my loneliness, about how much I hated my new, glossy life. He would just lick the tears off my face and lean his small body against mine. He didn't ask me to be grateful. He was just there. He was the first creature to show me unconditional affection since my parents died. When he was finally adopted by a kind elderly man, I was heartbroken but also happy. He had found his forever home. That shelter wasn't an eyesore. It was a place of healing. It had saved me, in its own small way. And now, the people who were supposed to save me were trying to tear it down. Standing there in my apartment, the city lights painting my face, the ghosts of my past swirled around me, the small, lonely girl with the scuffed suitcase, the heartbroken teenager with the soggy certificate, the child who found solace in the company of a stray dog, and I felt a shift. The despair, the sadness, it began to curdle, to harden into something else. It was cold, sharp, and clear. Resolve. The money wasn't just an escape hatch anymore. It was a weapon. It was a tool. It wasn't about revenge. Not at first. It was about preservation. It was about protecting the one place that had ever felt like a sanctuary. But as I thought about Beatrice's smug, cruel face, a new thought took root. It was a dark and satisfying thought. What if I could save the shelter and give them exactly what they deserved? What if I could use their own obsession with image and status against them? The decision was made. I wasn't going to run. I was going to stay. I was going to fight. And I was going to do it so quietly, so completely, that they would never see it coming. I picked up my phone and opened a new encrypted browser. My first search was for the top philanthropic law firm in the state. My second search was for the public records of the Paws and Hope shelter. The plan was no longer a vague notion. It was starting to take shape, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't just gratitude or grief. It was power. My first call was not to a real estate agent or a travel company, but to a man whose name I found on a list of the city's most discreet and effective lawyers. His name was Alistair Finch. He specialized in high net worth estate planning and anonymous philanthropy. He was, in essence, a professional ghost. His office was in a sleek, unmarked building downtown, the kind of place that valued privacy over signage. When I walked in, I was a nervous wreck, dressed in my nicest, but still very ordinary, clothes. I felt like an imposter. Alistair was the opposite of what I expected. He wasn't a shark in a pinstriped suit. He was a small, neat man in his late 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a calm, reassuring demeanor. He listened to my story, the whole tangled mess of it, the lottery win, my aunt and uncle, their campaign against the shelter, without a single flicker of judgment. He just steepled his fingers and nodded, his gaze steady and thoughtful. He was the perfect voice of reason. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Sharma, what you are proposing is not just a donation. It is a strategic maneuver. It is entirely possible, but it requires precision." I felt a surge of relief. I want to be a ghost, Mr. Finch. I want to save the shelter, but I want them to have no idea where the money came from. None at all. Anonymity is our specialty, he said with a small smile. We will establish a limited liability company, a shell entity, something with a suitably bland name. Let's call it the Benefactor Group. This LLC will be the legal entity making the donation. Its ownership will be buried under so many layers of legal protection that even the most determined journalist, or a pair of very nosy relatives, will find it impossible to trace back to you. Over the next few weeks, Alistair and I became a two-person command center. He handled the complex legal and financial architecture, setting up trusts and accounts that shielded my identity completely. My job was the on-the-ground reconnaissance. I needed to understand exactly what I was up against, and what pause and hope truly needed. To do that, I had to go back there. I put on an old pair of jeans and a nondescript hoodie and drove to the shelter, my heart pounding. I told myself I was just there to look, but I felt like a spy in my own life. The place was exactly as I remembered it, only worse. The years had not been kind. The paint on the front door was peeling, the chain link on the outdoor runs was rusted, and a palpable sense of weary desperation hung in the air. Inside, I met Sarah Jenkins, the shelter director. She was a woman in her 40s, with tired lines around her eyes, but a fire of fierce devotion within them. She mistook me for a potential volunteer, and I didn't correct her. She gave me a tour, and it was a tour of a sinking ship. She pointed out the roof that leaked every time it rained, forcing them to move cages into the already crowded hallways. She showed me the ancient, clanking washing machine that could barely handle the mountain of soiled blankets. The isolation ward for sick animals was little more than a converted closet. "We do our best," she said, her voice strained with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "But our best is not enough anymore. We're being squeezed from all sides." She told me about the pressure campaign from the Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association, a group my uncle Richard had founded and now chaired. "They're relentless," she sighed, running a hand through her messy ponytail. "They filed half a dozen nuisance complaints with the town council. Noise, smell, zoning violations. Most of it is nonsense, but it costs a fortune in legal fees to fight. Fees we don't have." She led me to her tiny, cluttered office. Pinned to a bulletin board was a formal notice from the town. It was a hearing to revoke their operating permit. The hearing my uncle had been so smug about. "This is it," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This is the end of the line. We have 3 weeks until the hearing. Unless a miracle happens, they're going to shut us down." "Richard Albright," she said, my uncle's name with a weary bitterness, "will finally get his way." Listening to her, my resolve hardened into steel. This wasn't just about my feelings anymore. This was about Sarah and her exhausted team and the hundreds of animals that depended on this place. This was a real, tangible fight, and I had a secret weapon they couldn't even imagine. This became my subplot, my personal mission. I wasn't just saving a building. I was saving Sarah's life's work from the petty vanity of my own family. I left the shelter that day with a fire in my belly. I went straight to Alistair's office. It's worse than I thought, I told him. They need more than just a donation to patch the roof. They need a fortress. Alistair, ever the strategist, had already been doing his own research. He pulled out a large, dusty book of town ordinances. I think I've found something, he said, tapping a page with his finger. It's an old, almost forgotten bylaw from the 1950s, designed to encourage the establishment of charitable institutions. It states that any registered nonprofit that undertakes a capital improvement project exceeding a certain value, a value that hasn't been adjusted for inflation, by the way, is granted a 10-year exemption from any rezoning challenges and most nuisance complaints. I stared at him. What does that mean? In English, he smiled. It means that if we don't just give them money to fix the leaks, but instead give them enough to build an entirely new state-of-the-art facility, we can trigger this ordinance. We can legally box your uncle in. He can file all the complaints he wants, but for the next decade, the town council's hands will be tied. We will use the law to build a shield around them. The plan was audacious. It was brilliant. It was so much better than just running away. We weren't just going to save the shelter. We were going to transform it into an untouchable permanent fixture, right in the sightline of my aunt and uncle's patio. The leverage wasn't just the money. It was the obscure, dusty rulebook they thought they controlled. We worked out the details. The Benefactor Group LLC would make a formal offer to the Pause and Hope Board of Directors. It wouldn't be a simple check. It would be a comprehensive grant for $7 million, $2 million for a new veterinary wing with modern surgical suites and a proper isolation ward, $3 million for a complete teardown and rebuild of the old kennel structure into a bright, airy adoption center with indoor-outdoor runs and cadios for the feline residents, $1 million to establish an endowment for future operating costs, and $1 million for legal and administrative fees, ensuring they could retain a top-tier law firm, Alistair's firm of course, to handle the town and any other challenges. Alistair presented the offer to Sarah and her bewildered board. I waited in a coffee shop down the street, my phone clutched in my hand, my leg bouncing uncontrollably. After an hour, my phone buzzed. It was Alistair. They accepted, he said, his voice calm as ever. Sarah cried. The board chairman asked me 3 times if it was a prank. I assured them it was not. I closed my eyes. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of me. It was done. The first move had been made. The silent, grateful niece was gone. In her place was the Benefactor Group, and my aunt and uncle in their marble mansion had no idea that the war they had declared was already lost. They were about to be checkmated by a ghost. The first tremor of the earthquake I had started was felt at a town council meeting. I wasn't there, of course. My anonymity was my shield, but Sarah called me later that night, her voice giddy and breathless, and recounted the entire scene for me. The meeting had been packed. My Uncle Richard was sitting in the front row, flanked by his allies from the Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association, their faces smug and expectant. This was supposed to be their victory lap, the final nail in the coffin of Pause and Hope. The council president brought the shelter's permit revocation to the floor. Richard stood up, preparing to deliver what Sarah described as a pompous, self-congratulatory speech about civic beauty and property values. But before he could begin, Alistair Finch, looking immaculate in a tailored suit, stepped up to the podium. He introduced himself as legal counsel for the Pause and Hope shelter. A murmur went through the room. The shelter couldn't afford a bus ticket, let alone a lawyer from the most prestigious firm in the city. Richard looked confused, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Alistair, in his calm, measured tones, announced that he was there to withdraw the shelter's request for a permit extension. A wave of shock rolled through the room. Sarah said her heart dropped into her stomach. Richard's face broke into a triumphant grin. They were surrendering. "We are withdrawing the request," Alistair continued, pausing for dramatic effect, "because it is no longer necessary. As of last week, the Pause and Hope shelter has accepted a private, anonymous donation in the amount of $7 million. The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah said, "You could have heard a pin drop." Richard's grin vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. Alistair went on, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. He outlined the entire plan: the complete demolition of the old facility, the construction of a new adoption and veterinary center, and the establishment of a permanent endowment. Then came the master stroke. Furthermore, he announced, holding up a file, this capital improvement project officially triggers Town Ordinance 27B, which, as the council is aware, grants the institution a 10-year moratorium on all rezoning petitions and a protected status against non-health and safety-related civic complaints. Pause and Hope is not going anywhere. In fact, it's about to become a permanent and shining example of this town's commitment to compassion. Sarah described the scene as pure chaos. The shelter volunteers in the back of the room burst into tears and applause. The council members looked utterly bewildered. But the best part, the part Sarah recounted with undisguised glee, was the look on my uncle's face. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He was sputtering, trying to object, but the council president, reading the ordinance Alistair had provided, simply banged his gavel and said, "It seems the matter is resolved." My uncle had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and publicly humiliated. His petty crusade had been obliterated by an anonymous tidal wave of cash. My own moment of satisfaction came a few days later. I was at their house for what would be my final obligatory Sunday dinner. I went because I had to see it for myself. The news had broken in the local paper that morning. Mysterious benefactor saves animal shelter with multi-million-dollar gift, the headline screamed. I walked in to find a storm brewing. Richard was pacing the length of their cavernous living room, his face the color of a plum. Beatrice was on the phone, her voice shrill. "What do you mean you don't know who it is?" she snapped. "Someone doesn't just donate $7 million anonymously. Find out. Use your resources." She slammed the phone down and looked at me, her eyes narrowed. "Anya, you're quiet. What do you think of all this?" I took a slow sip of water, forcing my expression to remain neutral. "It seems like a very generous thing to do," I said, my voice deliberately mild. "The shelter must be very happy." "Happy?" Richard roared, stopping his pacing to glower at me. "It's a disaster. It's a slap in the face. Some tech billionaire, probably, some upstart from the city, who thinks he can just throw his money around and ruin our neighborhood. This isn't generosity, it's an attack." It was everything I could do not to laugh. Their narcissism was so profound they couldn't conceive of any other motive. They couldn't imagine someone doing something out of pure kindness. It had to be a personal slight, a move in a power game they didn't know they were playing. The weeks that followed were a symphony of their frustration. A week after the announcement, a huge privacy fence went up around the Pause and Hope property. Then, the demolition crews arrived. The sounds of progress, the roar of bulldozers, the beep-beep of trucks backing up, the clang of steel beams, became the new soundtrack to life in Crestwood Hills. From their patio, the eyesore they had complained about was now a full-blown, large-scale construction site. The view they cherished was gone, replaced by cranes and scaffolding. Their panic escalated. They tried everything. Richard, through his homeowners association, filed a dozen complaints about noise violations. Alistair's legal team swatted them away like flies. Beatrice tried to rally the neighbors, but the tide of public opinion had turned. The story of the miracle donation had made the shelter a local cause célèbre. Anyone seen to be opposing it now looked like a monster. They were completely and utterly powerless. The beautiful, orderly world they had built and controlled was being invaded, and the enemy was an invisible, benevolent ghost. Every morning, they woke up to the sounds of my secret victory being built, brick by brick. And every evening, I would drive past the construction site, a quiet smile on my face, watching my new reality take shape. As the new shelter began to rise from the dust of the old one, a different kind of construction was happening in my own life. I was building boundaries, brick by painful brick. The first step was a physical one. I found a new apartment, a beautiful, sun-drenched loft in a converted warehouse on the other side of the city. It was twice the size of my old place and had a small balcony where I could grow flowers. I paid the entire year's lease up front, in cash. The feeling of signing that lease, knowing that no one was subsidizing it, that it was entirely my own, was a liberation I hadn't known I was craving. I moved on a Saturday, with the help of a moving company instead of my own aching back. As I unpacked the last box, I stood in the middle of my new living room and took a deep breath. It smelled like fresh paint and freedom, and I hadn't given Beatrice and Richard my new address here, but a new address, and moved on a Saturday, with the help of a moving company instead of my own aching back. I hadn't even told them I was moving. This was the beginning of my own personal exodus. I was quietly, methodically, removing myself from their orbit. At first, they didn't even notice. They were too consumed by what they were calling Sheltergate. Their phone calls to me were breathless, angry monologues about the construction noise, the audacity of the anonymous benefactor, the incompetence of the town council. I would listen, make non-committal sounds, and then politely end the call. I was a gray rock, offering no emotional purchase. The shift happened about a month after I moved. Beatrice called, her voice frantic. "Anya, where on earth are you? I've been calling your old apartment and the line is disconnected. We have the Hendersons coming for dinner tonight, and our caterer just canceled. I need you to come over and help. It's an emergency." It was so typical. An emergency was not me being missing. It was her dinner party being in jeopardy. For 20 years I would have dropped everything and run to her rescue. I would have played the part of the dutiful niece, the unpaid event assistant. But this time, I took a breath and said, calmly and firmly, "I'm sorry, Aunt Beatrice. I can't. I have plans." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Plans? What plans could be more important than this? "We need you." "I'm busy," I said, the words feeling foreign and powerful on my tongue. "I moved, by the way. I'll forward you my new address when I get a chance." "You moved?" Her voice was a squeak of indignation. "Without telling us, after all we've done for you." There it was, the final, desperate arrow in her quiver guilt, the classic refrain that had kept me in my place for 2 decades. But it didn't work anymore. The wound it used to target had scarred over. "I have to go, Beatrice," I said, using her first name without its honorific for the first time in my life. "I'll talk to you later," and I hung up. I stood there, my heart hammering, but I felt a thrilling sense of lightness. I had cut one of the master strings. Their attempts to reassert control became more desperate. Richard left me a blustering voicemail, offering me a real job at his investment firm, a condescending offer of a pity position to bring me back under his thumb. I deleted it without a reply. Beatrice sent a barrage of texts, alternating between saccharine sweetness, "You miss you, darling," and pointed jabbed, "You miss him. I hope you remember who was there for you when you had nothing." The final, perfect piece of the puzzle fell into place by complete accident. The new Pause and Hope building was nearly complete, a beautiful modern structure of glass, warm wood and stone. Sarah, the shelter director, was planning a grand unveiling gala. In a moment of what she saw as magnanimous community building, she decided to send invitations to everyone in town, including the members of the Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association. "We want to show there are no hard feelings," she told me over the phone. "We're taking the high road." I of course received an invitation addressed to a valued friend of Pause and Hope. But then a week later, I overheard something spectacular. I was in a coffee shop, and a few women from my aunt's social circle were sitting at the next table. "Did you hear?" one of them whispered. "Beatrice Albright is convinced the special tribute at that animal shelter gala is for her and Richard. She said someone on the town council told her they were honoring a prominent local family for their long-standing civic leadership." I nearly choked on my latte. Their narcissism was a force of nature. They had spent months trying to destroy the shelter, and now, through a garbled piece of third-hand gossip, they had convinced themselves they were being honored at its opening. Beatrice couldn't fathom a world where a major event in her town wasn't about her. She saw anonymous benefactor and special tribute and her brain connected the dots in the only way it knew how to herself. Sure enough, 2 days later, a call came from Beatrice. Her voice was dripping with triumphant, syrupy condescension. "Anya, darling," she cooed. "I do hope you'll be at the Pause and Hope Gala next week. Richard and I are being honored. It's all very hush-hush, but they're giving us an award for our contributions to the community. It would mean so much to us if you were there to see it." The sheer, unadulterated gall of it left me speechless. She was not only attending, she was claiming credit for my secret victory. She was planning to stand on a stage in the house that I built and accept praise for an act of kindness that was the polar opposite of her entire being. The irony was so rich, so poetic. It was almost a work of art. "Of course, Aunt Beatrice," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The night of the gala was cool and clear, the kind of perfect autumn evening that makes you believe in happy endings. I arrived early, dressed in a simple, elegant dark blue dress. I wanted to blend in, to be a fly on the wall for my own masterpiece. The new shelter was breathtaking. Gone was the dilapidated shack, replaced by a warm, welcoming building that glowed from within. The main hall was filled with people, a mix of shelter volunteers in their simple khaki vests, townspeople in their Sunday best, and the Crestwood Hills elite, dressed to the nines. I saw Sarah moving through the crowd, her face radiant with a joy that was so profound it almost made me tear up. Then they arrived. Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Richard made an entrance, not an arrival. She was wearing a floor-length gold gown that shimmered under the lights, her diamonds flashing. He was in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his face puffed up with self-importance. They glided into the room as if they owned it, nodding graciously to the people they passed, accepting invisible accolades. They were the conquering heroes, arriving to receive their laurels. They complained in hushed, theatrical whispers about the building itself, still so much bigger than it needs to be, Beatrice muttered, but their faces were plastered with benevolent smiles for public consumption. I watched them from my corner, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. This was it, the culmination of months of planning, of a lifetime of quiet resentment. It was no longer about simple revenge. It was about a reckoning. It was about forcing them to look at the truth, just for a moment in front of the entire world they had worked so hard to impress. The ceremony began. The mayor gave a speech. A few local dignitaries spoke. Then Sarah Jenkins stepped up to the podium. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke of the shelter's journey from the brink of extinction to this incredible new beginning. She talked about the despair, the fear, and then the single, miraculous act of grace that changed everything. "We may never know the name of the person who did this," she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd, "and they may wish to remain anonymous forever. But their legacy is not anonymous. It is here. It is in these walls. It is in the lives that will be saved within them. This benefactor didn't just give us money. They gave us hope." I saw Beatrice preen, giving Richard a small, knowing smile. She was ready for her close-up. She smoothed her gown and subtly shifted her weight, preparing to stand. "And so," Sarah continued, her voice rising, "it is my great honor to officially dedicate this new facility, to unveil the tribute to the quiet, compassionate soul who made this all possible." With a flourish she pulled a cord. A large velvet cloth fell away from the wall behind her, revealing a massive, gleaming bronze plaque, brilliantly lit for all to see. The room fell silent as people leaned forward to read the elegant script engraved upon it. I didn't need to read it. I knew what it said. "The Anya Sharma wing, dedicated with love, from a quiet friend." The silence in the room stretched for a heartbeat. Then two. Then a ripple of whispers began to spread as people turned from the plaque to look for the name. They were looking for me. My gaze, however, was locked on my aunt and uncle. I watched Beatrice's perfectly constructed smile freeze, crack, and then crumble. Her face went slack, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. She stared at the plaque, her eyes wide with a horror so profound it was almost comical. She looked from the name, my name, to me standing quietly in the crowd. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Uncle Richard went from a ruddy, confident red to a ghastly, sickly white. His jaw worked silently. The tuxedo that had looked so powerful moments before now seemed like a hollow costume. All around them, the gears were turning in people's minds. The pieces were clicking into place with an audible, crushing finality. The niece, the quiet, overlooked orphan, the anonymous benefactor, and then the ones who had led the public, vicious campaign to destroy the very thing now named after her. The humiliation was total, it was absolute, and it was silent. Our eyes met across the crowded room. In that one look, a lifetime of unspoken things passed between us. Their shock, their betrayal, their utter, devastating incomprehension, and my quiet, unshakable resolve. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply gave a small, slow nod. It was a confirmation. It was an ending. That single, tiny gesture broke the spell. Beatrice let out a sound, a strangled gasp, and turned, grabbing Richard's arm. Without another word, they fled. They pushed through the bewildered crowd, their heads down, their grand entrance inverted into a shameful, desperate exit. They didn't just leave the party. They were cast out of the world they had built, not by force, but by the sheer, unbearable weight of the truth. The doors swung shut behind them, and in the stunned silence they left behind, I finally allowed myself to take a deep, cleansing breath. In the weeks following the gala, a profound quiet settled over my life. The angry, frantic phone calls from my aunt and uncle stopped. The manipulative texts ceased. It was as if a constant grating noise I had lived with my entire life had finally been switched off. The silence was beautiful. I learned through Alistair what happened next. The story had ripped through Crestwood Hills like a wildfire. The sheer hypocrisy of what Beatrice and Richard had tried to do, contrasted with the quiet generosity of what I had done, was a scandal too delicious for the gossip mill to ignore. They were pariahs. Old friends suddenly stopped returning their calls. Invitations to parties and charity boards mysteriously dried up. The social standing they had spent their entire lives cultivating had evaporated overnight. About a month after the gala, a for sale sign went up on their sprawling lawn. Alistair forwarded me the listing. They were selling the estate. As he explained it, they simply couldn't bear it anymore. They couldn't bear waking up every morning and seeing the beautiful, thriving Anya Sharma wing from their patio. They couldn't stand the constant, silent reminder of their public humiliation. They were running away, seeking anonymity in a way I had once craved, but for entirely different reasons. They were fleeing the consequences of their own character. I felt a strange cocktail of emotions. There was a grim satisfaction, a sense of karmic justice served cold, but there was no joy in it. There was no triumphant laughter. There was just peace. A quiet, settled peace. The dark, tangled knot of resentment I had carried in my chest for 20 years had finally dissolved. I spend most of my weekends at the shelter now, not as a benefactor, but just as Anya, a volunteer. I walk the dogs, I clean the kennels, I sit with the scared, newly arrived cats, and whisper to them that they are safe. Sarah knows, of course. She gave me a hug one day that was so full of gratitude, it left me breathless. But to everyone else, I'm just part of the team. I find a profound, simple joy in the work, in the tangible act of caring for something small and helpless. Last week, I was sitting in one of the new, sunlit puppy enclosures, with a litter of clumsy golden retrievers tumbling all over me. One of them fell asleep in my lap, his little chest rising and falling in a steady, trusting rhythm, and looking down at him, I realized what this was all about. It was never really about the money, or the building, or even the revenge. It was about the silence. They lived in a world of noise, loud opinions, loud money, loud status. They tried to silence the barking of a few lonely dogs because it interfered with their perfect, quiet view. But true silence isn't an absence of noise. It's an absence of fear. It's the quiet trust of a sleeping puppy. It's the peaceful hum of a place filled with hope. They wanted to create a sterile, empty silence. I chose to build a living, breathing one. So I'll ask you what I sometimes ask myself in the quiet moments. Was it revenge? Or was it just a rebalancing of the scales? Some people might say I went too far, that the public humiliation was a cruel punishment, and maybe it was, but their cruelty was aimed at destroying something beautiful for the sake of their own vanity. My actions, born from that same conflict, created something beautiful that will last for decades. It feels like a different kind of math. It wasn't about tearing them down, it was about building something they could never touch. What would you have done? Would you have just walked away with the money and built a new life, or would you have stayed to fight? I'm genuinely curious to know, so please, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all. And if you've ever felt overlooked, or had your kindness mistaken for weakness, just know that your story isn't over yet. Sometimes the quietest people have the most profound impact. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found some satisfaction in it, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories about the underestimated finally getting their due. Until next time.